The HMBS Flamingo was a 103-foot patrol craft, modest, fast, and proudly Bahamian. Commissioned just 2 years earlier, it symbolized a young nation taking charge of its own destiny at sea. Her captain, Commander Amos Rowe, was a seasoned naval officer seconded from the Royal Bahamas Police Force. His second in command was Sub-Lieutenant Anthony Allen, sharp and steady. The remainder of the crew were young recruits, mostly barely in their 20s, full of pride for their new Royal Bahamas Defense Force. When HMBS Flamingo left for its tour of duty on Thursday, May 8, 1980, they were taking over from a sister ship in the naval fleet, the HMBS Marlin. They had just returned from their Southern Islands patrol. The ensemble of mixed Marines, most on loan from other duties, had no way of knowing what tragedy would befall them in the coming days, thrusting this small island nation into the spotlight in the eyes of the world. After all, this was just another routine trip. Their first stop on Thursday evening was South Eleuthera. Commander Amos Rowe, the proud steward of this ship, gave his crew an early R&R with a stop in South Eleuthera during the late hours of Thursday. Several hours later on Friday morning, they were on their way again to patrol the southern Bahamas. Their job, routinely securing the Bahamas against poachers and keeping a watchful eye out for illegal immigrants. They were the protectors of the borders of the Bahamas. Friday was an uneventful day. Cladwell Farrington, a young able seaman on board, wrote in his book, Because of May 10th, the Flamingo Incident, how it was such a routine day. The men played cards, fished, read books, congregated until required to man their stations. He recalls they went aboard only one tourist pleasure boat to investigate and routinely approve their personal firearms on board that day. Friday ran into Saturday, May 10th. They were patrolling the waters in the southwest region, west towards the area of Anguilla Key. Sub-Lieutenant John Allens, the navigator, noticed a blimp on his radar about a mile away. Commander Rowe decided to pursue it. In the distance, they could see smoke billowing from two apparent fishing boats, definitely located in Bahamian waters. The boats had that look of poachers. Commander Rowe aggressively pursued the suspected fishermen. However, when realizing the Bahamas Royal Defense Force boat was en route towards them, the two fishing boats attempted to outrun the HMBS Flamingo, despite repeated calls over the ship's loudspeaker system to stop. Yet, it still was not until Commander Rowe ordered Marine seaman David Gunner Tucker to strap into the Flamingo's 20mm gun on board and fire. First, a warning shot over the fishing boat's bow, then eventually having to shoot out an engine on one of the boats before they both came to a stop, just 4 miles off Key Santo Domingo. Again, unmistakably still in Bahamian waters. Commander Rowe dispatched a 6-man search and armed boarding team, led by Sub-Lieutenant Allen, to approach and inspect the Cuban fishing vessel. Able seaman Whitfield, Seaboat Captain Neely launched and skillfully steered the ship's dory alongside the fishing boats, allowing the team to board and carry out their investigation. As suspected, all 8 men, apparently Cubans, were in fact fishing and had an estimated 3,000 pounds of shallow water scale fish, lobster, conch, and stone crabs between both boats on board. The men were advised of their arrest and their boats were taken into custody. A radio communication was sent to Nassau, informing headquarters of the arrest. However, as the story unfolds, it is not clear whether that radio communication was actually received, as subsequent radio messages also appear not to have reached New Providence over their antiquated 1980 ship-to-shore communication equipment. Nevertheless, Commander Rowe decided, being that far in the south, it would be easier to tow the Cubans' boat to the nearest port for processing, namely Duncantown, Rocket Island. And so their boats were taken in tow behind the HMBS Flamingo. The armed Marines stayed on board the Cuban fishing boats as Seaboat Captain Neely in the dory escorted the boats behind the HMBS Flamingo. Within minutes of arresting the Cuban fishing vessels and beginning the tow, 2 Cuban marked MiG fighter jets appeared from nowhere overhead, circling the area in an unmistakable hostile manner. They swooped low over HMBS Flamingo, so close that the pilots' faces were clearly visible from the HMBS deck. Royal Bahamas Defense Force Marines were accustomed to seeing Cuban aircraft when patrolling near their borders, but this felt different. The jets' movements were aggressive, deliberate, menacing. Commander Rose sensed the danger immediately. "Come, gentlemen," he warned his men. "We gotta get out of here. These aircraft are flying in a way I don't like this. They're coming too close." The MiGs roared past the ship, just above the water surface. Their speed sending walls of seawater spraying high into the air, then vanishing into the distant sunset, returning again, screaming overhead, faster than sound. Visible before their thunderous roar could be heard, they repeated this taunting maneuver several times before finally disappearing into the golden horizon of the setting sun. Believing the threat had passed, Commander Roll ordered the Flamingo lead the way south toward Ragged Island, rather than risk any unnecessary delay. By reboarding the inspection team from the captured Cuban boat, he decided it was safer and faster to have them follow behind, with able seaman Whitfield and Neely steering the dory alongside. That quick decision would later prove to be the reason many lives were saved that day. It seems the mates were gone. The ocean fell quiet again, the tension easing. But that calm lasted barely 45 minutes. Suddenly, a thunderous explosion tore through the side of the Flamingo, ripping a near 6-foot hole into her hull. Years later, Whitfield, recalling the event, remembers hearing a faint whistling sound just before the blast. He said it was the only warning they had that the attack had resumed. The MiGs had returned, this time firing missiles, machine guns directly at the ship. Chaos erupted. The Flamingo shook violently, flames and black smoke rising as she began to take on water. The ship's main walking area was hit hard. The davits used for lowering the dory shattered. Shrapnel rained across the vessel. Fires spread quickly as 2 more bombs struck in rapid succession. One near the galley at midship, another tearing open the stern. Machine gun fire ravaged the deck as Marines scrambled for their lives, leaping into the water, some with life vests, others without. The lifeboats were destroyed immediately in the initial blast, shredded and deflated like punctured balloons. The young men of the newly formed Royal Bahamas Defense Force, barely 6 months into their service, found themselves facing an unimaginable reality. Their ship under siege, their training powerless against the fury of this aerial attack, fighting not now for duty, but for their own lives. Chaos and fear gripped the Flamingo Marines. An air of confusion prevailed. Crew members could be seen running everywhere with terrified eyes, realizing the Cuban aircraft had attacked the ship and the ship was unprepared to protect itself from that level of aggression. The HMBS Flamingo was bombed 3 times. The ship was on fire with 3 gaping holes, 3 to 5 feet wide each time. Those MiG jets fired air-to-surface missiles hitting the Flamingo by the smokestack, near the starboard, just below the midship line. They were sinking the ship. Cries of, "Oh Lord, help us! Swim, man, swim!" could be heard coming from the waters. Marines were diving underwater, ducking bullet fire. Understandably, panic set in. Some were in the water barefoot, others with their boots on. Marines were shell-shocked, not knowing what to do next. Commander Roll was the last to leave the ship. He was picked up out of the water by Whitfield in the dory. And his first reaction on board was to ask Whitfield, "Laddie, you got the men on board?" Regardless, still displaying concern for the welfare of his crew, Whitfield had in fact brought all the survivors he picked up out of the waters to board the Cuban boat. It was on board that Cuban boat, though, after a head count, they realized that 4 of the crew members were missing. That day, the Bahamas had lost 4 of its sons in that attack. Marine Seaman Fenric Sturrup, Marine Seaman Austin Smith, Marine Seaman David Tucker, and Marine Seaman Edward Williams. As darkness fell and the roar of the MiGs faded into the distance, a Cuban military helicopter remained behind, its powerful spotlight sweeping the waters where the HMBS Flamingo was slowly disappearing beneath the waves. A Cuban helicopter crew hovering over the sinking ship apparently left to search for any remaining movement, obviously to fire their machine guns at any survivors. By divine providence, they failed to spot the group of Bahamian survivors huddled quietly aboard one of the Cuban fishing boats just a few yards away in the darkness. In a solemn moment of grief and solidarity, once the helicopter had left, the surviving crew stood and made a final salute to their sunken ship and to their 4 fallen comrades. Commander Robe then turned his focus to ensuring the safety of his remaining crew. To avoid detection should the attackers return, he ordered all lights extinguished on the captured Cuban boat, using only the faint glow from a cigarette to illuminate the vessel's compass. Robe navigated in the dark towards the nearest island, Ragged Island. Cuban fishermen made a vain attempt earlier to disable their fishing boat from being used to escape by pulling a vital pin from the engine, but it was subsequently discovered by one of the Marines, fixing it so that the boat did get back in working order. By the early hours of Sunday morning, the survivors, Commander Rowe, 14 Bahamian crewmen, and the 8 Cuban prisoners landed on a beach at Ragged Island. Marines Theo Kirby and John Wallace, who were familiar with the island, led the exhausted group from the shoreline into Duncantown. It was around 1 a.m., and the settlement lay silent as his residents were asleep. The band woke the local police officer, who, constrained by the island's outdated 1980s type communication equipment, struggled to make contact with Nassau all through the night. Actually, it was not until around 6 a.m. that news of the survivors finally reached Defense Force and police headquarters in the capital. At daybreak, the tension heightened once more. Cuban aircraft returned, buzzing low over Duncantown in a menacing display, likely realizing that some Bahamians had survived. The flyovers were brief though, ending as quickly as they began. Perhaps after intelligence suggested that the Commodore of the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, Commodore Finley, and the head of the Royal Bahamas Police Force, Salathiel Thompson, were on the island, and possibly believing that more of a Bahamian rescue team was on the way. By mid-afternoon on Sunday, Mother's Day, a chartered DC-3 aircraft flew the men home. The survivors and their Cuban captains were flown safely back to New Providence, where they were met with relief, grief, and national pride. The government of the Bahamas was initially stunned by the attack and immediately demanded answers. By midnight on Sunday, after hours of intense communications and uncertainty, Deputy Prime Minister and Acting Prime Minister Arthur Deanna addressed the local and international media. He outlined what the government knew at the time, but stopped short of declaring an official course of action. Prime Minister Finley, who was abroad in Britain, cut his trip short, returned home by Monday, May 12th. Upon his arrival, he met with the grieving families, grieving officers, and Marines of the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, offering words of comfort and commending their courage and bravery in the face of aggression on behalf of the country. Cuba at first denied any involvement in the attack, but later reversed their position, issuing an apology and calling the incident a tragic mistake. Across the Bahamas, though, the reaction was one of anger, intense patriotism. Many Bahamians were demanding swift retaliation. Public demonstrations erupted in Nassau. Among the protesters were several prominent citizens who gathered to denounce the visit of the Cuban delegation that had come for talks with External Affairs Minister, the Honorable Paul Adley. Despite the public outcry, Prime Minister Lyndon Pilling appealed for calm and restraint. He announced that the Bahamas would present its case before the United Nations, choosing diplomacy over direct confrontation. His measured response was widely respected abroad, but met with sharp criticism at home, where many felt the nation's pride demanded a stronger, more forceful answer. In the end, Cuba formally accepted responsibility for the attack and agreed to compensation for the Bahamas. The settlement included $10 million payment for the loss of the HMBS Flamingo, $100,000 to each of the families of the fallen Marines, and $90,000 in fines for the 8 Cuban fishermen involved, though they were never imprisoned. 4 Bahamian sons were lost that day, and 15 returned from an unforgettable experience, defending the waters of the Bahamas. The memory of the HMBS Flamingo endures, not as a symbol of tragedy alone, but also of unity, pride, and resilience. May 10th, 1980. May we never forget.